Hello, my name is Tyler, and my presentation is on Benjamin Banneker and Dr. Daniel Hale Williams. First, who we will begin with is Benjamin Banneker. He was an African American scientist who really rose above the racial suppression of his time. Oftentimes today, we hear of the popular white scientists, some including, say, Ben Franklin. We hear of Albert Einstein, and even in today's age, we have Stephen Hawking. But usually, we do not hear of these African American scientists whom really excel in what they're studying and really go beyond in their field of study. What we see with Benjamin Banneker is a vast majority of brilliances which he brings to the table that are often overlooked. Many people have never even heard of Benjamin Banneker, and hopefully this presentation displays just how brilliant this African American man is. So to start out, Benjamin Banneker, a little background information. He was born November 9th, 1731. He died on October 9th, 1806. He lived in Maryland. He was originally born in Maryland and grew up and raised in Maryland and eventually died in Maryland. And like I said previously, he was an African American scientist, which throughout his science experiences, he developed an interest in astronomy. So throughout his life, racism played a huge role within his education. He was self-educated. At a young age, he went to a Quaker school uh, just for a couple years until eventually the racial suppression kind of caught up with him and he did not attend to that school anymore. So a large majority of his education was from himself. His grandmother also influenced his education greatly. She taught him how to read, how to write. Uh, Growing up with racism, Benjamin saw racism firsthand and learned about it firsthand. His mother was an indentured servant, African American, and his father was also a slave. So Benjamin really knew everything about the racial suppression which was going on at this time period. So why Benjamin Banneker? He was a brilliant African American scientist. Oftentimes we do not hear of African American scientists at all, but we hear about the European descent scientists or the white scientists who excel and exceed expectations in their scientific area. He was a self-educated African American in a time where slaves were very popular. Racial suppression was very popular. In this time period, African Americans did not succeed. He was taught about the human rights and social justices by his grandmother. And also, what played a big role in Benjamin Banneker's life is growing up with his mother and father. His mother being an indentured servant and his father being a slave really made Benjamin Banneker passionate to fight against the racial suppression and racial stereotypes that were present at this time against African Americans. So, what was the importance of Benjamin Banneker? And really, what did he do that makes him such a brilliant scientist or a brilliant African American, say, activist, for example, as we will talk later on? So, his importance, he made the first irrigation system. Benjamin grew up on a farm and eventually ended up owning his own farm. And here he created an irrigation system which would water all of the crops for his farm. He was a big tobacco farmer as listed below, which really led to his success, which was unheard of for an African American. Benjamin Banneker also created the first wooden clock. It is said that this clock kept accurate time, and this clock worked for more than 50 years after Benjamin Banneker had passed away. Also, Benjamin was a brilliant astronomer and mathematician. Due to his astronomy and mathematician skills, he could forecast eclipses, something that has never been done before Benjamin Banneker. So, other than his very excelling and brilliant inventions, Benjamin Banneker was really famous for his almanacs. He came out with many different almanacs. These all included astronomy calculations, medical information, which is later then used by doctors for centuries, and most importantly, he came out with title information. And at this point, title information was a very key concept for the success of fishermen in telling when tides could come in and when tides went out. This really led to the success of Banneker's almanacs within the area in which he grew up in, as well as word traveling throughout areas. It became very popular to read these almanacs and to listen to Banneker's idea of tidal information, which can then lead to further success for many fishermen and many other water-bearing jobs that rely on this tide information. Most importantly of all, Benjamin Banneker was really fighting the suppression of racism and really aiming for the human rights of the African American people. In his Almanac of 1795, Benjamin writes a letter to Thomas Jefferson, and the unique thing about this is Benjamin Banneker, being a African American, writing a letter to Thomas Jefferson, who is a slave owner. This was very unique for this time. Through this letter, Benjamin fights for civil rights. He fights for the African American slaves and overall community to have the same to equal rights as the Caucasian or white people within the area. He promoted many ideas to Jefferson, but I think the most important was that Banneker thought Jefferson should see Africans as more than just slaves. He needs to see the brilliance in which many people can bring to the world, such as Benjamin Banneker has. A quote from this letter is, "Readily embrace every opportunity to eradicate that train of absurd and false ideas and opinions which so generally prevail with respect to us." Us meaning African Americans. I think that this is a very unique and very powerful of Benjamin Banneker to write to Thomas Jefferson. Also, through his letter, Banneker quoted that writing a letter to Thomas Jefferson is, quote, liberty. And I think that liberty is a very important role which eventually leads to the overall equality or kind of social economic gap closure of the African American people and the whites. So the next person I will talk about is Dr. Daniel Hale Williams. He was a very successful man, African American. He also overcame racial suppression, which led to great success as well as great opportunity to bring the African Americans closer to equality. So, for a little background information, Dr. Daniel Hale Williams was born January 18th, 1856. He died August 4th, 1931. He was an African American surgeon, and the unique thing about Dr. Daniel is he did not right away have this idea of becoming a surgeon. Almost always, it was impossible for an African American to be successful at this time, let alone becoming a surgeon. It was almost an impossibility that could not be overcome. Um, Dr. Daniel also fought suppression of racism, but instead of writing a letter, Dr. Daniel opened his own hospital, which we will see later on in the presentation how it relates to fighting this suppression of racism and this overall racial tension at this time. So, like Benjamin Banneker, Dr. Williams grew up kind of with this racism forming who he is. His father was a member of an equals rights league. They promoted black rights, they promoted equal rights, and overall tried to overcome this barrier of racism in which so many African Americans were put into. As discussed earlier, Dr. Williams was not a surgeon right off the bat. He had many failed professions. He once was a shoemaker, and he did not like that. So one day he decided to do an apprenticeship with a doctor, and he loved the job. He loved the medical field. He wanted to do something in the medical field, and he wanted that to be his future. So he ended up going to Chicago Medical School, where he would pursue his degree or doctorate as a surgeon. So why Dr. Williams? So I chose Dr. Williams because he's a brilliant African American doctor. And me being a pre-medicine student with hopes of becoming a physician someday, we do not hear about these African American doctors. In many documentaries that we see successful white or European descent doctors. We do not hear of these African American doctors. The latest doctor that I have heard of that would be African American is Dr. Ben Carson. This is not because he was in a documentary or he was brought up in a class, but it was simply because CNN made him famous. He was running for president. That is the only reason why I heard of Dr. Ben Carson, who is really the first African American doctor that I have heard of throughout my medical career. So back to Dr. Williams, why I chose him is he fought against racism. He opened the first ever interracial hospital. Many times that slaves were not allowed to get medical treatment. Uh, his hospital name was Provident Hospital, and it was in Chicago. And it was also a nursing school, which is kind of unique because it accepted all races as patients, as students. Many African Americans could not become successful because they were refused health care, or if they were a medical professional, they were not allowed to have any jobs. And Dr. Williams really went against that so-called norm at the time and opened his own hospital, which promoted interracial and multiculturalism within a hospital setting of both workers and patients. So some more key points about Dr. Williams is he was an African American doctor, which already defied the odds of African Americans at this time. But he performed one of the first open heart surgeries. This is huge in the medical aspect of things because at this time there were no blood transfusions or modern day techniques which we use today. After his success as a heart surgeon, he became the chief surgeon of Freedmen's Hospital. This hospital was really for slaves. It cared for former slaves as well as many different races. Dr. Williams also provided opportunities for African American healthcare providers. At this time, African Americans were not allowed to be successful. They were under racial suppression. They could not hold a job, whether if they had a degree or not. It was not allowed. So at every hospital that Dr. Williams worked at over the years, he allowed African American healthcare providers to join his team. He co-founded the National Medical Association, which was also huge for the African American community because it was the opposite of the American Medical Association. In the National Medical Association, African Americans were allowed, whereas the American Medical Association, they were not. So his National Medical Association really promoted this diversity, which is key to the success of Dr. Williams. After his co-founding of the National Medical Association, he continued on with his hospital work, and he taught at very many different universities. He taught the techniques of medicine, and he taught how equality has to be within the school as well as within the workplace. And Dr. Williams was a key component in this, and he really displayed this firsthand of what diversity and equality should be. He drove the African Americans over the barrier of racial suppression at this time and really gave them a step forward in the success and the positivity that they need to overcome the racial suppression that they were forced with. So when talking about a relation to one of the aspects of the Sisters of Mercy, I would say that it really relates to the racism aspect, as we saw in the Sisters of Mercy's listing. Both of these men fought against racial suppression, which was almost unheard of for this time, due to the gap between the white privileged Caucasians and the slaves who were mostly African Americans. They both were extremely brilliant men who overcame this barrier of racial tension, and they gave opportunity to all the minorities. In Banneker's case, his letter to Jefferson was a huge step in leading many African Americans to the equality and overcoming that barrier of racism. In Dr. Williams' case, he hired African Americans as workers. He accepted slaves as patients. Uh, he was overall just a brilliant man and really drove home this idea of equality for African American people. Dr. Williams also taught interracial groups, which really fits with this idea of multicultural education. All were welcome into his lecture. It wasn't just whites or it wasn't just African Americans, but it met somewhere in the middle and it was both. Really exceeding this idea of diversity and exemplifying this idea of multicultural education within a classroom. So now we ask, how does it relate to our MEPS reading in chapter 11? And what principle does it relate to of multicultural education? Both Benjamin Banneker and Dr. Williams both really kind of relate to two different principles. Uh, Benjamin Banneker can be taught within a classroom to establish a classroom setting that promotes human rights. Many things can be learned from Banneker within a classroom, but oftentimes we do not focus on the African American scientists, which are hugely successful in the history of the United States. We focus on the European scientists or the American scientists who all have white skin color. This does not promote human rights within the classroom. It does not promote multicultural education. This teaching of Benjamin Banneker is key to a classroom in order to promote human rights for African American students within a classroom, or other diversities and ethnicities which may be within a classroom that only hear of the white scientist or the white popularity, which is a success. They need to see their own cultures as being successful to help drive home this idea of multicultural education. So like I said previously, the overall principles are kind of different in between both men, but they can both be seen as the same. Dr. Williams is a model for social justice and equality within a classroom. He displays equality so perfectly within his outdoings and what he does and his actions that learning through Dr. Williams will promote equality and social justice within a classroom. Dr. Williams, because of this, also relates to the principle of believing that all students can learn. Dr. Williams was a professor. He did not just focus on white people, or he did not just focus on African Americans, but he really engaged in this multicultural education, which helped both the white and black people within his lectures. So he's a prime example of what multicultural education should be and how we can carry that out for our students as well. And here is the works cited page, and I would like to thank you for listening, and I hope that you learned something good, and I hope that you enjoyed it. Thank you.